The gun came out of nowhere. Maria Kendrick heard the hammer click before she saw the weapon, and her entire body went rigid with a cold that had nothing to do with the November wind cutting across the Rio Blanco Crossing. The man standing 6 feet in front of her was not a man who asked twice. Everyone in 3 counties knew that. Everyone in 3 counties gave Edgar Bancroft exactly what he wanted, exactly when he wanted it, with a smile stretched tight across their terrified faces. She did not smile. She looked at the toll box nailed to the wooden post at the head of the bridge, read the hand-painted sign that said crossing fee, 15 cents, and she opened her coin purse with steady fingers. The leather of the purse was cracked at the seam. She had sewn it herself twice already. She counted out 1 dime and 1 nickel and set them on the flat of the post without a tremor in her hand. 15 cents, she said. Exact. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Edgar Bancroft stood in the brutal morning light with his revolver still raised, his dark eyes moving from the 2 coins to her face and back again, with something that looked almost like confusion. He was tall in a way that seemed deliberately designed to block out the sun. His coat was the color of old blood, and his jaw was several days past a shave, and the scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to the edge of his mouth gave his face the permanent look of a man who had already won every argument he had ever entered. He had stopped 17 wagons this week alone. He had made a railroad surveyor weep openly in front of his crew. He had once held up a mail coach for 45 minutes simply because the driver had met his eyes with something insufficiently deferential. Every single one of those people had fumbled their coins, dropped them in the dirt, offered too much, offered too little, apologized, stammered, or begged. Maria Kendrick did none of those things. She stood beside a wagon so heavily loaded with furniture and bolted crates that one of its rear wheels was visibly bowing under the weight. Her dark hair was pinned under a dusty hat with a broken brim. There was a smear of axle grease on her left cheek that she clearly had not noticed or had not cared about. Her coat was too thin for the weather, and she looked at Edgar Bancroft the way you look at a toll sign, with complete businesslike attention, nothing more. He lowered his gun. It was the most surprising thing anyone at the Rio Blanco Crossing had seen in 6 years of Edgar Bancroft operating there, and the 2 men loitering at the far end of the bridge, both of whom worked for him, exchanged a look that neither of them could entirely explain. Edgar picked up the 15 cents. He stepped aside. Maria clicked her tongue at her horse, the old bay gelding named Franklin, who was as unimpressed with Edgar Bancroft as his owner appeared to be, and the wagon rolled across the bridge, and that should have been the end of it. It was, instead, the beginning of everything. 3 months earlier, Maria Kendrick had been a school teacher in a small Ohio town called Harwick that sat on the edge of a river that flooded every spring without apology. She had a room above a dry goods store, a subscription to a scientific journal she read cover to cover, a small collection of books she had curated with extreme care, and an absolute absence of anything she would have called a future. Harwick was the kind of town that held you gently by the wrist and called it an embrace. She had watched other women her age marry and settle, and become part of the furniture of their own lives, and she had loved them, she had. But she had also spent her evenings sitting at the window above the store watching the river, and feeling something tight and restless living just behind her ribs that she had no satisfactory name for. When her father died in the spring of 1878 and left her a 40-acre land claim in the New Mexico territory that she had not known existed, she understood it as a door opening. Her mother had died 3 years prior. She had no siblings. There was no one in Harwick who would genuinely mourn her departure beyond the temporary inconvenience of finding a new teacher, and she knew that because she was honest with herself in ways that other people found unsettling. She sold everything she could not carry. She packed everything she could not sell. She hired a driver in St. Louis to bring her as far as Santa Fe, and then drove herself from there in a second-hand wagon she bought for less than it was worth, because the seller had been in a hurry to leave the territory, and Maria was not a woman who felt guilty about a fair negotiation. She had a Colt single-action Army revolver in a wooden box under the wagon seat that she had purchased in St. Louis, along with 30 rounds of ammunition, and a pamphlet explaining how to load and fire it, which she had read 3 times and memorized. She had never fired a gun in her life, but she intended to learn. The land claim was 40 acres on the eastern side of the Rio Blanco Valley, near a growing settlement called Larson Creek, that was in the process of deciding whether it wanted to be a cattle town or a farming community, and had not yet committed to either. The valley was extraordinary. Maria had not expected to feel anything about landscape, having grown up in Ohio, where the land was pleasant and moderate and asked nothing of you emotionally. But the first time she came through the pass above Larson Creek, and the valley opened up below her, enormous and copper-colored and absolutely indifferent to her presence, she had gripped the reins tightly and felt something unlock in her chest. This was the place, then. This was where the tight, restless thing behind her ribs would either grow into something real or dissolve entirely. She had not known, coming down through that pass, that to reach her land she would need to cross the Rio Blanco at the only suitable crossing within 20 miles. She had not known about Edgar Bancroft. She had not known about the toll, or the reputation, or the gun, or the silence that followed exact change. But she was getting ahead of herself, because before all of that there was the matter of Larson Creek itself, and what she found there, and who she found there, and how those findings would later make the crossing matter in ways that went far beyond 15 cents. Larson Creek in November of 1878 was a settlement of approximately 340 people, depending on how you counted the ranchers whose spread stretched far enough out from the main street that the question of whether they lived in town or merely visited it was philosophically complicated. There was a general store run by a man named Abbott who was cheerful and overpriced. There was a hotel called the Larson House that was clean enough and had a dining room that served a reasonable beef stew. There was a doctor whose name was Prentice, and who also pulled teeth and set bones and had opinions about everything. There was a livery, a blacksmith, a land office, a saloon called the Blue Handle, and a church that was used ecumenically because there were not enough of any single denomination to justify exclusivity. There was not a school. This mattered to Maria in 2 directions at once. It meant there was no employment waiting for her in the occupation she knew best, which was a practical concern. But it also meant there was a gap, a genuine and felt absence, that she could potentially fill, which was something else entirely. She filed that away and went to find the land office to confirm her claim. The land office was run by a young man named Collins who was 22 and earnest, and who had the organizational instincts of a particularly tidy squirrel. He found her claim file without being asked, confirmed the 40 acres, walked her through the boundary markings with a hand-drawn map, and told her that the previous owner, a man named Kendrick who she confirmed was her father, had never visited the land, had acquired it through a government lottery in 1872, and had never improved it. There was no structure on the property. There was a creek that ran through the northern edge and good grass in the lower field and a stand of cottonwoods near the eastern boundary that would provide some windbreak, but beyond that she was starting from nothing. "You'll need to cross the Blanco to get there," Collins said, and his voice changed slightly when he said it, the way voices do when a name carries weight. "Through Bancroft's Crossing." "What is Bancroft's Crossing?" Maria asked. Collins explained. It took longer than she expected, because the explanation kept acquiring details. Edgar Bancroft had appeared at the Rio Blanco Crossing approximately 6 years ago, in 1872, when the territory was still wild enough that a man with sufficient nerve and no official opposition could simply decide to charge for the use of a bridge that technically belonged to the public. He had repaired the bridge, which had genuinely needed it, and had subsequently claimed a proprietary interest in it that no one with legal authority had ever formally challenged because the county seat was 60 miles away, and the judge there had, apparently, more pressing concerns. He charged 15 cents per wagon, 5 cents per horse, and 3 cents per person on foot. He had 2 men who worked for him, both of whom had histories of their own that discouraged close examination. He had never, to anyone's knowledge, actually shot anyone at the crossing. He had come extremely close on several documented occasions. His reputation was built on proximity rather than completion, which was, if anything, more effective. "Is there another way across?" Maria asked. "Nearest crossing is 20 miles north at Carson's Ford," Collins said. "It's passable in summer." "Right now after the rains, probably not." 15 cents, Maria said. "Yes, ma'am." "Then I will pay 15 cents. Collins looked at her for a moment with an expression she was already becoming familiar with, the expression people wore when she did not react to things the way they expected. "Mr. Bancroft can be somewhat intimidating in person." "I'm sure he can," Maria said, and picked up her map. She spent her first night at the Larson house, and in the morning she drove her loaded wagon to the Rio Blanco Crossing and encountered Edgar Bancroft and his gun and his silence. And she laid 15 cents on the post, and he stepped aside, and the wagon rolled across the bridge, and she did not look back. She did not look back because she had learned that looking back was a form of permission. It invited the thing you had just passed to follow you. She had left Harwick without looking back, and she intended to cross every threshold the same way. But the back of her neck prickled all the way across that bridge, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that some portion of that prickle was not fear. She spent the next 3 weeks living out of her wagon and building the bones of a life. A rancher named Horace Dellum, whose land abutted hers to the south, was a large, weathered man of 50 who had been in the valley for a decade, and who helped her locate and hire 2 men from town to build the foundation and frame of a one-room house, which would be expanded later when she had the money. She worked alongside the builders every day, learning by doing, earning their initial surprise and subsequent respect through sheer consistent usefulness. She was not afraid of a hammer or a nail or the particular ache of a muscle she had not known she had. The restless thing behind her ribs eased slightly with each day of physical work, each solved problem, each wall that stood when the wind tested it. She crossed the Rio Blanco 3 more times in those 3 weeks, once to buy supplies at Abbott's store, once to attend a community meeting at the church where the question of a school was raised, somewhat to her surprise, by Dr. Prentice, who had apparently been agitating for one for 2 years. Once to carry a broken plow blade to the blacksmith whose name was Henrik and whose repairs were guaranteed. Each time she paid exact change at the toll post. Each time Edgar Bancroft was there. Each time he took the coins and stepped aside in silence. But the second time she noticed that he watched her cross the bridge with an attention that seemed different from what he applied to other travelers. Not threatening. Something else. The third time, as she passed through on the return, he said nothing, but he tipped his hat the smallest possible amount, so small she might have imagined it. She did not imagine it. On the 4th crossing, in early December, the rear wheel that had been bowing finally decided it had endured enough and cracked cleanly through with a sound like a rifle shot, right in the middle of the bridge. The wagon lurched and listed badly, and Franklin, the horse, stopped with an offended dignity that would have been amusing under different circumstances. Maria climbed down into the cold and looked at the wheel and assessed the situation, and came to the conclusion that she could not fix this herself. Edgar Bancroft walked onto the bridge from his end. He looked at the wheel. He looked at the load. He looked at her. He did not say anything immediately, and she did not say anything either, and the river ran under them cold and quick and indifferent. "You need a jack and a spare," he said finally. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not reach for volume because it had never needed to. "I have a jack," Maria said. "I do not have a spare." Another silence. The wind moved across the bridge with a particular cruelty. "I have a spare wheel that might fit that axle," Edgar said. "It's at the station house." The station house was a low, solid building on the near bank where Edgar and his 2 men lived, or at least sheltered. Maria had looked at it every time she crossed. It had a stone chimney and a corral and a lean-to shed, and it had the look of a place that had been made functional through sustained effort and nothing more, where comfort was not the point. "How much?" Maria asked. He looked at her again with that particular look, the one she had been cataloging without quite deciding what it meant. "It's a spare wheel," he said. "I'll lend it, and when I bring it back, I'll have Franklin reshod for free," he said. "That horse needs new shoes before the ground freezes hard." She had noticed that too. "Agreed," she said. He went to the shed and came back with the wheel and a jack, and he fit the wheel to the axle with the efficiency of a man who had done it before and would do it again, and did not consider it remarkable. And it fit well enough to get her across, and he loaded her broken wheel into the wagon bed to be repaired by Henrik. "My name is Maria Kendrick," she said as she climbed back to the seat. "I know who you are," Edgar said. He did not offer his name in return, but they both understood that she already knew it. She clicked Franklin forward. At the end of the bridge she glanced back just once, and he was still standing where she had left him, watching the wagon go, and she turned her eyes forward again and told herself that meant nothing at all. She did not entirely believe herself. She began to ask questions about him in the careful way. She asked questions about everything, gathering information without making the gathering obvious. What she learned came in pieces and from several sources and was not always consistent. Dr. Prentice knew the most and was the most reluctant to share it, which she noted as significant. Collins at the land office knew some things and shared them freely without understanding their weight. Horace Dellum knew more than either of them and shared nothing, which was its own kind of communication. What she assembled from these fragments was a portrait of a man with a hidden past so layered that it had the quality of a trap he had built around himself. Edgar Bancroft had come to the territory from somewhere east, possibly Tennessee, possibly further. He had been a lawman somewhere. That was the most consistent element of the various accounts, a deputy or perhaps a marshal in a town whose name varied depending on the teller. Something had happened in that town, something significant and dark and not cleanly resolved. He had arrived at Rio Blanco with money enough to repair the bridge and no apparent reason to explain himself, and he had simply stayed, and over 6 years his presence had calcified from an anomaly into a fact about the landscape. He was approximately 32 years old. Maria was 27. She noted this with the same neutrality she applied to all facts, and then noted that she had noted it, which was itself a kind of information. She returned the spare wheel 2 weeks later. It was a Saturday in mid-December, and the sky was the particular shade of pewter that meant snow before dark. Edgar came out of the station house when she drove up to the crossing, and this time there was something almost prepared about him, as if he had known she was coming, which was not impossible in a small valley where people noticed a woman driving a wagon. He took the wheel from the wagon bed with easy strength and leaned it against the station house wall. "Henrik's work?" he asked, looking at the repaired spoke. "He's very good," Maria said. "He is," Edgar agreed. She had Franklin's hooves to offer in exchange, and Edgar checked all 4 of them with expert hands, speaking quietly to the horse in a way that made Franklin calm and cooperative in a manner he was not always cooperative with her. She watched Edgar's hands on the horse's legs, the gentleness of them, the knowledge in them, and she thought about the gun at the crossing and the scar on his face, and the way those 2 things did not reconcile easily with the gentleness. "You were a lawman," she said. His hands paused on Franklin's rear hoof, just for a moment. Then he set the hoof down carefully and straightened and looked at her, and she saw something move across his face that was complex and guarded and possibly dangerous, and she met it head-on because she did not know how to do otherwise. "Who told you that?" he said. Several people implied it and one person confirmed it accidentally, she said. Dr. Prentice. Prentice talks too much. He didn't tell me what happened, only that something did. The wind moved between them, and the pewter sky pressed lower. Edgar Bancroft looked at her for a long time, and she let him look without trying to fill the silence, which was something she had learned was its own form of patience, that some people needed the silence to be safe before they could move in it. I was a deputy marshal in a town called Caldwell, he said at last. In Kansas, 6 years ago. She waited. There was a man I was meant to bring in, a man named Hollis Crane. He had killed 2 people in a dispute over grazing land, killed them cleanly and in front of witnesses, and didn't seem to particularly care about the witnesses. I tracked him for 3 weeks across 2 territories, and I found him and I arrested him and I put him in a cell and I rode to the county seat to tell the judge. He stopped. He looked at the wheel against the wall. When I came back, the cell was empty. The sheriff who was supposed to be watching the jail had let Crane go. The sheriff's name was Harlow, and Crane had been paying him for years, and I had not known that, and that was the first failure. Edgar's voice remained level throughout all of this, the way a river remains level when it runs over flat stone. Crane had also killed the 2 witnesses to the original murders while I was gone. And the sheriff's deputy who had apparently objected to the arrangement. That was the second failure, my failure, because if I had understood what I was riding into, I might have prevented it. How would you have prevented it? Maria asked quietly. I don't know, that's the part I've lived with for 6 years. His jaw was tight. I went after Crane again. I found him a week later. I brought him back. And the judge at the county seat, who I later understood had also been receiving payments, found insufficient evidence to hold him and released him. Maria was quiet for a moment. The first flakes of snow were beginning to fall, small and determined. Where is Hollis Crane now? She asked. Dead, Edgar said. He died in a fight in Abilene in 1874. Someone else's justice, not mine. He paused, which was perhaps fitting. And the sheriff and the judge. Harlow lost the election in 1875 and died of drink in 1876. The judge was removed from the bench for unrelated corruption and moved to Denver. Edgar's mouth curved slightly, and it was not quite a smile. The law has its own pace. Sometimes it arrives. And you came here. I came here, he confirmed. I was done being part of a system that could be bought and sold around me while I was trying to use it honestly. At least out here what I am is what I am. There is no pretense about it. You charge for a public bridge, she said, not accusatory, just direct. I do, and I am the only reason that bridge is still standing and the crossing is safe. I repaired it with my own money and I maintain it, and in 6 years the county has sent exactly no one to manage it. Something in his voice shifted slightly. I am aware that it is not strictly legal. I am also aware that without me, half the valley could not cross when the river runs high. Both things are true at once. How much have you collected in 6 years? She asked. He told her. It was a specific number, the kind of number you know because you have thought about it. It was not a fortune by any measure. It was a working amount. The amount of a man who was keeping himself alive and maintaining something and not accumulating anything beyond necessity. That is not the behavior of a man who is stealing, Maria said. Something changed in his face. Something that had been locked for a very long time shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, and he looked at her with the expression she could not quite name, that she had been cataloging for weeks, and she understood for the first time what it was. It was the expression of someone who had been seen clearly and had not yet decided if that was safe. It's getting dark, she said, looking at the thickening snow. I should get back. You shouldn't cross the bridge tonight, Edgar said, and there was something in his voice now that was different too, more careful, more particular. Snow's coming hard. The bridge gets slick in the first snow before the temperature drops far enough to make it predictable if Franklin spooks or the wagon slides. Are you suggesting I stay on this side of the river tonight? There's a boarding house in town, he said, 2 miles east. Mrs. Calloway runs it. She's decent. Maria looked at the bridge. She looked at the snow. She looked at Edgar Bancroft. "The boarding house costs money," she said. "My nearest neighbor, Horace Dellum, is 3 miles on the other side." She paused. "Is there room in the station house?" The look on his face then was extraordinary, not shock exactly, more like a man who has been standing in a high wind for so long that he no longer notices it, who suddenly feels the wind stop. "My men are there," he said carefully. "Are they dangerous to me?" He considered this with genuine seriousness. "No," he said, "not if I say otherwise." "Then I will sleep in the wagon in the corral if you have an extra blanket," she said. "I have my own provisions. I will not be any trouble, and in the morning when the bridge is clear, I will go." He studied her for another long moment, and then he went inside and came back with 2 blankets and a tin mug of coffee that was bitter and strong and exactly what the cold required. And he said nothing further about it. And she settled Franklin in the corral and bedded down in the wagon with the blankets, and the snow fell soft and steady, and she lay awake for a long time listening to the river and looking at the light from the station house window and feeling the tight, restless thing behind her ribs, which had been easing for weeks, now do something different entirely. It began to reach. In the morning the snow had stopped and the air was crystalline, and the bridge was clear and dry. And when she came out of the wagon, Edgar was already at the corral with grain for Franklin and a second tin mug of coffee for her. And they stood together in the cold light and drank their coffee and did not feel the need to fill the silence. And that was when Maria Kendrick understood that she was in serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble she had been afraid of at the crossing. A different kind. The kind that does not look like danger, and therefore gets past your defenses before you know it has arrived. She drove home across the bridge and spent the rest of that day working on the roof section she had been struggling with alone, and thought about Edgar Bancroft with enough frequency and focus that she twice measured the same board incorrectly. She was not accustomed to that kind of distraction. She did not particularly like it, but she was also too honest with herself to pretend it was not there. Christmas came to Larson Creek with a particular sweetness that first winter, partly because it was a community that was still early enough in its existence to celebrate its own survival. There was a gathering at the church that Maria attended. She brought a pie that she had made in the borrowed kitchen of Horace Dellum's cook, a woman named Rosa, whose opinion of Maria progressed from suspicious to grudging to warmly approving over the course of 3 baking sessions. Prentice was there, and Collins and Abbott and Henrik, and 60 or 70 others, and there was singing, and a reasonable quantity of food, and a warmth that was partly from the fire and partly from proximity, and partly from the simple human need to mark time and acknowledge community. Edgar Bancroft was not there. She had not expected him to be, and yet she found herself on the walk home taking the long route, which passed within half a mile of the crossing, and then felt immediately irritated with herself for doing so, and took a direct route home, and went to bed and slept without dreaming. In January, Dr. Prentice formally asked her at a community meeting if she would consider establishing a school. There was, he explained, a building available, the old land surveyor's office that had been vacated when the survey company moved its operations to Santa Fe, which had 2 large rooms and a stove and a reasonable roof. There were 31 children in the valley currently receiving no formal education. There was a fund, modest but real, that had been collected by parents over the previous 2 years against the day when a qualified teacher might appear. Maria was apparently and self-evidently qualified. Would she? She would. The school opened in the first week of February 1879. She had 23 students on the first day, ranging from age 6 to 14, which made for a pedagogical challenge she met with the systematic intensity she applied to everything. She organized them by ability rather than age, which caused some initial resistance among parents who did not understand the logic, and more than initial enthusiasm among students who did. By the end of the first month, she had a routine and the beginning of a culture, and the particular satisfaction of a job being done correctly. She crossed the bridge twice a week for supplies and materials. She paid her 15 cents each way. Edgar Bancroft was always there, and he always took the coins in silence, but the silence had changed in quality. It was no longer the silence of a man demonstrating that he required nothing from you. It was the silence of a man who was deciding something. She recognized the difference because she was doing the same thing. In late February, on a Tuesday afternoon when the students had been dismissed and she was in the schoolroom organizing the following day's materials, Edgar Bancroft appeared in the doorway of the school. She looked up and did not appear startled, though in fact she was. He was not wearing his gun, or rather he was wearing it holstered and buttoned down, which in the calculus of the West was the equivalent of leaving it at home. He was wearing a clean shirt. He had shaved. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "Come in then," she said. He came in and looked around the room with the careful attention he applied to everything, taking in the students' work pinned to the walls, the chalk drawings and the arithmetic tables, and the map of the United States she had tacked above the front board. "Where did you get the map?" he asked. "I brought it from Ohio," she said. "It was mine from a classroom there." He looked at it for a moment. Something in his face was soft. She had not thought of that word in connection with him before, and its arrival surprised her. "I wanted to ask," he said, "if you would let me bring you something, to the school, books. I have books." She was quiet for a moment. "What kind of books?" "History, science." "Some literature, I have. I have a collection that has been traveling with me for a long time and not being used." He was choosing words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. "Children should have access to them." "Yes," she said, "they absolutely should." He brought them the following Thursday. 12 books in a wooden crate, carried across the bridge and through the town and set on her desk with a care that was almost ceremonial. She opened each one. They were good books. The kind of books a man reads when he is alone and has decided that thinking is the only freedom available to him. There were margins notes in some of them, in a precise and slightly cramped hand. She read several of the notes, and they were the notes of a rigorous, questioning mind, a mind that disagreed with received wisdom and said so in pencil in the margins of other men's arguments. "You've read all of these," she said. "Several times, some of them. You should come and discuss them with the older students," she said, looking at him directly. "Some of these ideas are the kind that need argument to become real." He looked like she had suggested something he could not quite categorize. "I'm not a teacher. You know these books," she said. "That's enough to start." He came on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks later. The older students, 7 of them between 11 and 14, were initially uncertain what to do with a large man who sat at the back of the room and did not smile. But Maria introduced him as a person who had read extensively and thought about what he had read, and she asked him a question about a passage from one of the history books, a question she had prepared specifically, because she knew it would get him talking. And it did. And within 20 minutes 2 of the older students were arguing back at him with the particular energy of young people who have discovered that adults can be challenged, and that it is allowed. He left that afternoon with an expression she could not identify, but that made her chest ache in a way she was not going to examine in public. He came back the following Friday, and the Friday after that. By April, they had a routine that neither of them had formally proposed and neither of them had formally acknowledged. He came on Fridays to the school. She stopped at the crossing on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he always had coffee made at the station house, and she always accepted it, and they talked for 10 or 20 minutes before she drove on. She had learned things about him gradually. The way you learn the shape of a landscape by walking it rather than viewing it from above. He had grown up in Tennessee, yes, the son of a carpenter, a man of some education but no wealth. He had gone west at 19 because Tennessee after the war had the feeling of a wound that had not been allowed to close. He had been a deputy for 4 years, and he had believed, genuinely and without cynicism, in the possibility of order. And then Hollis Crane and Sheriff Harlow had taught him about the gap between what you believed and what was true, and he had carried that lesson with him like a stone in a pocket. He had never married. He told her once, very close to it once, with a woman in Caldwell who had waited for him while he was away tracking Crane and who had been reasonable and warm, and had ultimately and wisely chosen someone else during the long months when he was gone following a ghost across 2 territories. He had understood her choice and had not blamed her and had wished her well genuinely, but it had added itself to the accumulation of things he had learned not to reach for. Maria told him about Harwick and the school there, and the flooding river and the dry goods store, and the window she had sat at in the evenings. She told him about her father, who had been a distracted man of genuine intelligence who had loved her, but had been perpetually occupied with a project that was always just ahead of completion, and who had therefore been present and absent simultaneously for most of her childhood. She told him about the land claim letter she had received after her father's death, and how she had understood it as permission. She had not used that word to anyone else. She had not expected to use it to him. It arrived in her mouth without her planning it, and she watched it land and saw the recognition in his face, the way it confirmed something he had suspected about her. "You're not here because you were brave enough to leave," he said. "You're here because you finally found something worth arriving at." She looked at him for a long moment in the spring afternoon sun that was making the river flash through the cottonwoods. "Yes," she said, "that's right." He looked at the river. "I envy you that certainty. You have no certainty about where you should be." "I have stayed here," he said. "I have not decided whether staying is the same as arriving." "It isn't," she said gently. "But it can become it." He looked at her then, and that expression was back, the one that had been a locked door, but was now something that had unlocked and was open the smallest amount, light coming through the gap, and she felt the ache in her chest intensify to the point where it was uncomfortable and clarifying at once. She said goodnight and drove home and sat on the step of her finished house, which now had 2 rooms and a proper porch and a kitchen with a working stove, and a small garden plot she had turned over the previous week, and she looked at the dark shape of the valley, and the stars coming out above it, and she thought, clearly and without flinching from the thought, "I am in love with Edgar Bancroft." She held the thought the way you hold a lit match, carefully, with awareness of what it could do. He had a dark past. He had a hidden wound that had not fully healed. He was operating on the uncertain edge of legality with a gun that had stopped many men. He was the most feared man at the crossing, and he had built that fear deliberately as a form of protection. She understood that now, a man who has been betrayed by the systems he trusted builds his own system and enforces it personally because that is the only way he knows to make it reliable. And he had shaved to come to her classroom, and he had carried 12 books across a bridge, and he had coffee ready on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And he had said, "I envy you that certainty," with an expression that was the closest thing to longing she had ever seen on a face that had practiced not wanting anything. The match was lit. The question was what it would ignite. In May, the question was answered by an external event, as questions often are in the Wild West, where the landscape and its inhabitants have a habit of forcing decisions that might otherwise be deferred indefinitely. A man named Silas Mott arrived in Larson Creek with 2 associates, and a claim that he was the legal representative of the Territorial Pacific Rail Survey Company, which was conducting preliminary surveys for a possible rail line through the Rio Blanco Valley. The survey would require, he explained at a public meeting in the church, access to the valley along the eastern route, which passed directly through the Rio Blanco Crossing. He was prepared to purchase an easement from the county, he said, and he produced documents to that effect, and he looked at the assembled faces of Larson Creek with the comfortable confidence of a man who has done this before and knows how it goes. What he was less prepared for was the question of the crossing's status. Collins at the land office found, upon examining the relevant documents, that Edgar Bancroft had 6 years ago filed a maintenance claim on the bridge that had been accepted at the county level, and that gave him a legal interest in the crossing that was more substantive than anyone, including apparently Edgar himself, had understood it to be. The crossing was not simply a bridge a man was using without permission. It was a bridge a man had formally claimed maintenance rights on, and those rights had been accepted by the county, and that created a situation that Mott's easement documents had not anticipated. Mott came to the crossing. Maria heard about it afterwards from 2 different sources and then from Edgar himself, on a Tuesday afternoon when the coffee was very strong, and his jaw was set in the particular way it's set when he was managing something. Mott had offered to buy Edgar out of his maintenance claim for $200 and a letter of commendation from the survey company. Edgar had declined. Mott had then suggested, with the particular kind of suggestion that arrives with 2 large men standing slightly behind the suggester, that Edgar consider the practical advantages of cooperation with a company that had significant resources and corresponding capacity to cause inconvenience. "What did you say?" Maria asked. "I said I was aware of the company's resources," Edgar said, "and that I had been managing inconvenience for 6 years and had not found it fatal." "They will come back," Maria said. "They will come back," he agreed. "Do you want to keep the crossing?" she asked directly. "Is it what you want long term?" He was quiet for a moment. "What I would want long term," he said, and his voice was very careful, "would depend on what long term looks like." She looked at him. He looked at her. The river ran through the cottonwoods with its usual indifference to the specific gravity of moments. "There is a proposal before the town council," she said, hearing her own voice from a slight distance, "about formalizing the school as a public institution under county authority. If that goes through, there may be paid employment in it." She paused. "Enough to support a household." His eyes were very still. "Maria," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was the first time he had used it, and it arrived with the force of a door opening fully. "I am not a woman who proceeds indirectly," she said. "I think you have learned that. You are the most direct person I have ever met," he said. Something that was definitely a smile was happening on his face slowly, the way sunrise happens. "In my experience, that is not always a virtue. I am also patient," she said. "I am not asking for anything immediate. I am asking if the question is available, whether there is something here worth—" She stopped, reached for the word, "worth arriving at." The smile completed itself. It transformed his face entirely. The scar and the set jaw and the 6 years of deliberate forbidding, all of it releasing at once into something that was almost boyish, almost young, almost like the man he might have been in Tennessee before the war, before Caldwell, before the bridge. "Maria Kendrick," he said, "I have been thinking about exactly that since November." She could feel the warmth in her face, and she did not try to conceal it. "Since November," she said, "when I handed you 15 cents and did not flinch." "That was the moment, yes," he said. "You have no idea what you looked like. Every single person who comes to that crossing looks at me like I am something they need to get past. You looked at me like I was a toll sign, like I was a thing to be dealt with correctly and then moved past. It was the most extraordinary thing anyone had done to me in years. I was terrified," she said. He stared at her. "You were not." "I was entirely terrified," she said firmly. "You had a gun at eye level. I was 27 years old and alone in a territory I had never been to, and everything I owned was in that wagon. I was terrified. You put the coins on the post and looked at me like I was furniture," he said. "I had decided that flinching would not help," she said. "That was the only choice available to me that I had any control over, so I did not flinch." She paused. "It is a technique I developed at age 9 when my father would forget my birthday. You simply decide that the thing that could hurt you will not hurt you, and you proceed on that premise, and occasionally it works, and occasionally it doesn't, but either way you have more dignity than if you had flinched." He was very quiet for a moment. "Your father forgot your birthday," he said. "Not every year," she said, "and he was a kind man. He was simply somewhere else most of the time." Edgar looked at her with something in his face that was so unguarded it almost undid her composure entirely. "I will not forget your birthday," he said. "If the question is available as you put it, I will not forget it." "It is June 4th, she said. "I will be 28. "I will remember that," he said. June 4th. He came to the school the following Friday, and he did not leave immediately after the discussion with the students. He stayed while she closed the schoolroom and banked the stove and gathered her papers, and they walked out into the spring evening together. And it was the first time they had simply walked together without a destination or a transaction. And they walked along the edge of the road where the grass was coming in green and new, and they talked about the Mott situation and the school proposal, and the way the valley looked in spring. And at the place where the road forked toward her land, he stopped. "I would like to come on Sunday," he said, "if there is something I could help with, at the property." "The porch railing needs repair," she said. "And the second room could use another coat of whitewash." "I can do both of those things," he said. "Sunday then," she said. He came on Sunday with his tools, and they worked side by side through the morning and into the afternoon. And Rosa from Horace Dellum's place appeared at midday with a basket that contained corn tortillas and slow-cooked beans, and a raised eyebrow at Edgar Bancroft that was thoroughly comprehending. And Maria introduced them, and Edgar was polite and Rosa's eyebrow lowered slightly in approval. And they ate lunch on the porch that Edgar was in the process of repairing, and the food was excellent, and the afternoon was warm, and Maria thought, This is what arriving feels like." The Mott problem escalated in June. Mott returned with 3 associates this time, and a letter from the territorial governor's office that he claimed legitimized the survey company's right to access the crossing regardless of the maintenance claim. Collins examined the letter carefully and told Maria privately that he thought the letter had been prepared with significant creative interpretation of the governor's actual authority, but that challenging it would require legal representation that the town did not have, and money the town did not have, and time that Mott was clearly counting on them not having. Edgar came to the town council meeting on the evening of June 2nd, 2 days before Maria's birthday, and he sat in the back of the room in the church, and he did not speak for the first hour while Mott and Collins and Prentice and the council members went back and forth. Then Edgar stood up. "The maintenance claim was filed and accepted," he said. "That is a matter of county record. Whatever that letter says, it cannot retroactively invalidate a county record without a court process, and Mott knows that because he has been through this before." He paused. Edgar had a quality of absolute stillness when he spoke in public that commanded the room the way his silence commanded the crossing, not through threat, but through the simple authority of a man who has thought carefully about what he is saying. "I would like to propose a different arrangement. I will donate the maintenance claim to the township of Larson Creek. The town becomes the legal owner of the bridge and its maintenance rights. I will continue to manage the crossing for a salary of $30 a month paid by the toll revenues. In exchange, the survey company can have their easement at a fee that goes to the town, not to me, and the crossing is protected under municipal authority rather than individual claim." The room was quiet. Mott opened his mouth. "The survey company," Edgar continued, his voice the same level river over flat stone, "will find it considerably more difficult to bully a township than to bully an individual. I believe Mott is aware of this. I believe that is why he has been negotiating with me rather than with your council." Mott's face was doing something complicated. The council voted that night. The proposal passed. Collins spent the next 2 days drafting the documentation, and on June 4th, the day of Maria's birthday, the deed was done, and the town owned the crossing, and Edgar Bancroft was its paid manager, and Silas Mott accepted the easement fee and left Larson Creek with the tightly managed expression of a man who has been handled more gracefully than he expected and is not sure how to feel about that. Edgar came to her school that June 4th with a book. It was a bound collection of the complete botanical illustrations of a naturalist whose work she had mentioned once in passing 3 months prior, in the context of a conversation about the plants native to the valley. He had somehow from somewhere located a copy of this particular book. She did not ask him how or from where because the fact of it mattered more than the logistics. She held the book in both hands and looked at him and could feel the birthday feeling expanding into something enormous and warm. "Thank you," she said. "Happy birthday, Maria," he said. She kissed him. She was the one who closed the space between them, and she did it in the same way she had placed the coins on the post at the crossing, with deliberate intent and no flinching. And his hands came up immediately to hold her face with the same gentleness she had observed in him with Franklin the horse and with the 12 books in the wooden crate. And the kiss was brief, but it was complete, and it confirmed everything she had understood since the night she sat on her porch step and held the lit match thought. He said, against her hair, in the voice that had never needed to reach for volume, "I was going to wait until you indicated clearly that this was acceptable." "I indicated by kissing you," she said. "Yes," he said, very direct. "It is my primary characteristic," she said. "You knew this." They were married in September of 1879 in the church at Larson Creek, which was full. This surprised Maria, who had not fully appreciated how central she had become to the community in less than a year, or how much the community needed a ceremony that was partly about two people, and partly about the particular hope that attaches itself to a woman who crossed alone into unknown territory, and made it home, and a man who had been holding himself at distance from everything good for 6 years, and finally allowed something in. Prentice officiated because the circuit preacher was 3 weeks away and Prentice had done it before. Rosa made a cake that was an engineering accomplishment. Horace Dellum wept openly and blamed dust. Collins gave a toast that was both too long and entirely appropriate. Edgar's 2 men from the crossing, whose names were Garrett and Webb, and whose histories Maria had learned over months of careful inquiry to be more complicated but less dark than initial impressions suggested, cleaned up and attended, and Webb, who was unexpectedly musical, played a fiddle through the dancing portion of the evening in a way that made the church floor shake. They danced together, Maria and Edgar, in the lamplight of that church with the smell of Rosa's cake and the fiddle and the warm press of a community around them. And he held her with the careful attention he applied to everything he valued, and she rested her cheek against his shoulder and felt the tight, restless thing behind her ribs, which had been reaching since December and arriving since spring, settle into something that had the quality of a foundation, solid, permanent, capable of building on. They moved Edgar's belongings from the station house to the property on the east side of the river in 2 wagon loads, and Maria looked at the books coming off the wagon and into the house with deep satisfaction. And Edgar looked at the house she had built from nothing in 11 months with an expression that was close to wonder. And she showed him the garden and the repaired porch and the second room that would serve as a study. And he stood in the doorway of that room and looked at the light coming through the window, and she stood behind him and put her hand between his shoulder blades and felt him breathe. "This is the first time," he said quietly, "that I have stood in a house and thought, I am going to live here." "Yes," she said, "that is what arriving feels like." Garrett and Webb continued to manage the crossing under Edgar's supervision, and Edgar divided his time between that work and the school where he had by now become a regular and genuine presence, the older students competing for his attention and his challenges and his marginalia-dense books. He was not a soft teacher. He was precise and demanding, and he expected students to argue and to support their arguments with evidence. And the older students loved him for it the way you love someone who takes you seriously enough to require your best. He also, with quiet thoroughness, taught Maria to shoot. He was patient and exact, and he started with the mechanics and the safety and the physical reality of the weapon before anything else. And after 8 sessions on the land behind the house, she could load and fire the Colt with reliability and reasonable accuracy. She would never be a gunfighter. She did not want to be. But she was a woman alone on 40 acres at the edge of what was still genuinely wild country, and she wanted to know that the wooden box under the wagon seat was an option she had mastered rather than a hope she was carrying. "You are very good at this," Edgar said. watching her reload with careful hands. "I am good at things I practice," she said, which was simply true. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was quieter than the previous year and louder in the ways that mattered. They learned each other with the same quality of attention that each of them brought to everything, which meant that they learned each other well and honestly, and without the softening fictions that some couples use to make the process more comfortable. They argued twice about significant things, and resolved both arguments through a combination of logic and the particular intimacy of two people who have decided that honesty is the non-negotiable foundation of their household. Edgar had a tendency to carry problems alone for longer than necessary before sharing them, a habit of the long solitude. Maria had a tendency to solve problems before asking whether solving them was what her partner needed, a habit of the long independence. They identified these tendencies in each other and named them clearly and worked at them, not perfectly, but consistently. In March of 1880, Maria confirmed what she had suspected for 6 weeks and told Edgar on a Thursday evening after supper on the porch with the spring sky going orange above the cottonwoods. He was very still for a moment. Then his hand found hers on the porch railing, and he held it with the careful attention that was the most Edgar thing about him, the thing that said, "I know the weight of this, and I am not taking it lightly." "Are you well?" he asked. "Entirely," she said. "A little tired in the evenings, otherwise completely well." "Are you—" He stopped, chose the word carefully. "Are you glad?" She looked at him. "Edgar," she said, "I am more than glad. I am astonished by the gladness." His hand tightened on hers. Something broke open in his face. All the careful management of feeling that was his particular defense. It simply opened, and what was underneath it was so full and unguarded that she felt tears come to her eyes, which surprised her considerably because she was not a woman who cried easily. "I am also astonished," he said, "by every piece of this." He looked at the valley, the orange sky, the cottonwoods, the garden that was beginning to come back from winter, the house they had built together. By all of it. She leaned her head on his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they sat on the porch until the stars came out, and the valley was enormous and indifferent and extraordinary all at once, and she was home. Their son was born in November of 1880, almost exactly 2 years after Maria had first crossed the bridge with her exact change and her steady hands. They named him Thomas. He was a solid, loud and emphatically present baby who from the first weeks showed signs of a personality that Prentice described as determined, Horace Delham described as like his mother, and Edgar described as perfect, which was not objective but was accurate to his experience. The birth was attended by Prentice and Rosa, and was longer and harder than the cheerful accounts Maria had received from other women had quite prepared her for. But she was honest with herself about that too, and her primary feeling when it was over, holding Thomas in the lamplight with Edgar's hand on her back, was not relief or exhaustion, but a specific and enormous satisfaction. The satisfaction of a thing accomplished. A thing that mattered in the same category as the house and the school and the garden. Which was to say, not separate from her life but the fullest possible expression of it. Edgar held his son with the careful hands that had held 12 books in a crate and the ears of a nervous horse, and the face of a woman who had handed him exact change. And Maria watched him discover fatherhood the same way he had discovered everything since she had known him, with complete serious attention and a willingness to let it matter as much as it mattered. And she thought, there it is. There is what a man looks like when he has decided that arriving is not the same as stopping. When he has decided that life accumulates forward rather than backward, and that everything that came before is not a wound but a road. Thomas was 8 months old when the Territorial Pacific Rail Survey Company returned to Larson Creek, this time with a different representative, and a set of documents that were, Collins admitted upon examination, more carefully prepared than Mott's had been. The new representative was a man named Aldrich, younger than Mott, less aggressively confident and more technically sophisticated in his approach. He came to the town council meeting and made a proposal that was genuinely reasonable. The survey company would pay for a second bridge, an additional crossing 1 mile south of the existing one, which would serve rail purposes and be built and maintained at the company's expense, while the existing bridge remained under township authority and continued to serve the community. The easement for the southern site was already county land. No private interests were being displaced. The company simply wanted to proceed without further delay. The council discussed it and voted and approved it, and Aldrich shook hands around the room with the competent ease of a man who had read the room correctly and brought the right proposal to it. And as he was leaving the church, he stopped and looked at Edgar Bancroft, who was standing near the door with Thomas asleep against his shoulder in the particular boneless way that sleeping infants take on the solidity of the person holding them. "Mr. Bancroft," Aldrich said. "Aldrich," Edgar said. "You are not what I expected," Aldrich said. There was no hostility in it, genuine observation. "What did you expect?" Edgar asked. "Mott described you as an entrenched obstacle," Aldrich said. "Someone operating from pure self-interest with nothing to lose and therefore nothing to negotiate with." Edgar's mouth curved. "6 months ago that description would have been more accurate than now," he said. Aldrich looked at the sleeping child. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you," Edgar said. Aldrich left and Edgar carried Thomas home across the bridge in the November dark, and Maria walked beside him and the river ran under them cold and quick as always, and she took Edgar's free hand as they crossed, her fingers curling around his in the dark. "You know what I was thinking about today," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about what Collins told me," she said, "when I first arrived and asked about the crossing. He said you were an intimidating man and implied I should be afraid. And I thought, well, I cannot afford to be afraid, so I won't be." "And you weren't," Edgar said. "I was," she reminded him. "Entirely and thoroughly." "You weren't," he said firmly. "Whatever you were feeling, you placed those coins with a steady hand and looked at me like furniture. And I have spent 2 years trying to explain to myself how someone could be terrified and completely composed at the same time. And the closest I have come is that you are simply more committed to your own choices than you are to your own fear." She was quiet for a moment, walking beside him through the dark with the river below and the stars above and their son asleep between them. "That might be the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "It is merely accurate," he said, which was the most Edgar possible response, and she loved him for it entirely. The school grew through 1881 and into 1882. The county formally recognized it and began contributing to its funding, which meant Maria had resources she had not had before. She hired an assistant, a young woman from Santa Fe named Dolores who had trained as a teacher, and who had the particular energy of someone at the beginning of their vocation. Edgar continued his Friday afternoons with the older students, which had by now become a recognized and almost celebrated institution within the school, the older students treating it with the intense seriousness that young people bring to things they sense are genuinely good for them. The rail line progressed through the valley over 1882, and the construction brought workers, and those workers brought commerce, and Larson Creek doubled in population by the summer of that year, and then doubled again. New buildings went up on the main street. The Blue Handle Saloon expanded. A second general store opened in competition with Abbott, who responded by improving his prices and his attitude with approximately equal effectiveness. A telegraph office opened, which connected Larson Creek to the county seat, and threw it to the wider world in a way that made Maria feel simultaneously more connected and more aware of how deliberately chosen her distance had been. Horace Dellum died in the autumn of 1882, quietly and without apparent suffering in his sleep, and was mourned by a valley that had grown up around his steady presence without entirely noticing that was what it was doing. Rosa stayed on the Dellum property as its caretaker at the instruction of Dellum's will, which had left the land to the township for eventual use as a public park or grazing commons, a bequest that was met with the particular tender emotion that practical generosity earns. Maria and Edgar attended the service, and Edgar gave the eulogy, which was not flowery and was better for it. A clear accounting of what Horace Dellum had been and meant to the valley, delivered in the voice that did not reach for volume because it had never needed to. Thomas was 2 by then, and had developed a habit of going directly to Edgar and demanding to be picked up every time Edgar entered a room, which Edgar complied with a thoroughness that suggested he found the demand entirely reasonable. Maria watched this and felt the warmth of it settle into her like summer sun into stone, slow and deep and permanent. They had been talking about the house. The 2 rooms were no longer enough. They had been enough for a year of marriage and then enough with Thomas for another year, but the school's success meant that Edgar's discussions there increasingly spilled into their evenings, with books spread on the kitchen table and notes being made and lesson plans being considered, and they needed a room for thinking. They also needed, though this had not been said explicitly until Maria said it one evening in the spring of 1883, with the directness that was her primary characteristic, more room for the family that she thought, if it pleased him, might continue to grow. "It pleases me very much," Edgar said, looking up from a book with an expression that had nothing careful about it. "Then we need a 3rd room immediately," she said, "and a 4th room within 2 years. "I will speak to Henrik," he said. "Henrik has retired," she said. "His nephew has taken the smithing, but Garrett built a house last year that I have examined, and it is very solid. He knows what he is doing." Edgar looked at her with the smile that still had the quality of sunrise, the quality of something that had been held back for a long time and released into full brightness. "How long have you been planning this conversation?" he asked. "Approximately 6 weeks," she said. "I was waiting for the right moment, and this is the right moment. It is a Tuesday evening in April and Thomas is asleep, and you are not reading a book that you cannot put down," she said. "Yes, this is the right moment." He stood up from the table and came to her and held her face in his careful hands the way he had on their first kiss in the schoolroom and said, very quietly, "Maria Kendrick Bancroft, I was the most feared man at the crossing, and you handed me exact change and did not flinch. And because of that and because of you I have a home. We have a home," she corrected. "We have a home," he agreed and kissed her, and the lamp on the table gave out its steady light, and outside the cottonwoods moved in the spring wind and the river ran below them in the dark, indifferent and permanent and beautiful. Garrett built the 3rd room that summer, and it was good. Maria designed it herself with the systematic thoroughness she brought to things that mattered, and it had 2 windows for light and a proper floor and bookshelves that Edgar built himself from cottonwood planks over 3 weekends with a precision that was almost architectural. The books migrated from their various improvised arrangements onto the shelves with a satisfaction that was, Edgar said, among the finest feelings he had encountered, which Maria understood completely. The 4th room was not needed as quickly as anticipated, because their 2nd child did not arrive until the spring of 1885. Another boy. They named him James, after no one in particular, because the name seemed to fit the particular quality of seriousness and intensity that he brought to the business of being a newborn and then a small child. James was quieter than Thomas and more watchful and more inclined to sit with a problem until he had solved it, which made him feel, Maria thought, very specifically like a Bancroft. Thomas was more immediate, more willing to try before understanding, more likely to announce his feelings to the room at large, which made him feel, Edgar said with the smile that had become the permanent feature of his face that she loved most, like a Kendrick. The school in the late 1880s had 47 students and 2 teachers, and a reputation that had reached Santa Fe, and generated a letter from a territorial education official, who came to visit and left with the expression of someone who had expected to be patronizing, and had instead been impressed. The school's approach, the mixing of ages by ability rather than year, the emphasis on argument and evidence and practical application of learning to the actual territory they lived in, the integration of the community into the curriculum through people like Edgar and Henrik's nephew and Rosa, and others who knew things that books could not fully convey. This approach was unusual and it was working. And the education official's letter to his superiors said so, with a candor that was clearly influenced by the visit to the school. Edgar by 1887 had transitioned almost entirely from crossing management, which Garrett handled with quiet competence, to a role in the school that was not officially titled, but was understood by everyone to be something like associate teacher, specifically for the older students, and specifically for history and science, and what you might call the art of thinking rigorously, which was a subject the school treated seriously, even though no one had quite named it that way before Edgar arrived. He had also, with the same quiet thoroughness that characterized everything he did, made his peace with the territory's legal system. Not the blind peace of a man who has stopped caring, but the considered peace of a man who has decided that the system can be worked within and improved from the inside more effectively than denounced from outside it. He became involved with the township's governance in small ways, attending council meetings consistently, contributing to the discussions of road maintenance and water rights, and the question of a formal sheriff's office for Larson Creek, which had grown large enough by now to need one. When the vote came for a town sheriff in the spring of 1889, several council members came to him privately and asked if he would consider standing for the position. He discussed it with Maria at length over several evenings, the books cleared from the kitchen table and the lamplight between them and Thomas, who was 8 and increasingly aware that adult conversations had a texture that was different from ordinary talk, and who therefore sat very quietly in the corner on these evenings pretending to look at a book of illustrations while clearly listening. "I gave up on that system," Edgar said. "You gave up on a specific version of it," Maria said. "The version where it was corrupt and you were alone. This is a different version." "Is it?" "Larson Creek elected Collins to the council," she said, "and Prentice serves on it voluntarily. And they came to you rather than to someone else because they believe you would do it honestly. That is not the same system that had Harlow in it." He was quiet for a long time. Thomas turned a page in a way that was carefully calibrated not to draw attention. "The dark past does not determine the present," she said gently. "That is the thing you taught me about yourself, Edgar. That staying can become arriving. That what you build forward is the real thing, not what was built against you. I taught you that." "You said it about yourself and I remembered it," she said, "as I tend to do with things that are true." He looked at her with the full and unguarded face that she had unlocked in him over 10 years of honest love. "I will stand for it," he said, "if you think it right." "I think it is exactly right," she said. Thomas lowered his book the smallest amount, and then raised it again, and Maria caught the movement and met Edgar's eyes, and they exchanged the specific communication of parents who are managing an audience, which was to say the wordless language of two people who had built something together, and understood each other completely across the distance of a kitchen table in the lamplight, with the river running below them in the spring dark. Edgar was elected sheriff of Larson Creek in June of 1889 by a margin that indicated not just approval but genuine community feeling, the kind of election that says, "We have been waiting for someone like this." He wore the badge with the same quality of quiet seriousness he brought to the schoolroom and the crossing and the porch and the kitchen table. He was fair. He was precise. He was deeply disinclined to use force when other tools were available and deeply effective at using other tools. That voice that did not reach for volume, that stillness, that quality of making people feel that he was paying complete attention and would not be moved by anything less than the truth. He was also, as the newer arrivals to Larson Creek discovered with reliable surprise, not the fearsome, isolated figure of rumor. He was a man who came home every evening to a 2-windowed house with bookshelves he had built himself, where a woman who had crossed a bridge without flinching was probably cooking something or grading papers, or telling their elder son to stop eavesdropping and their younger son to stop trying to climb the bookshelf, and where the lamp was always on, and the door was always open to the right people. On a Friday evening in the autumn of 1889, Maria sat on the porch in the late light and looked at the valley that was turning gold and copper in the seasonal change. The same colors it had been the first time she saw it through the pass all those years ago. Edgar came up the road from town on horseback, and she watched him come with the same quality of attention she had always brought to him, the attention that had been cataloging him since November of 1878 and had never stopped finding things worth noting. He was 43 now, and his dark hair had gray at the temples, and the scar on his face had settled into the landscape of his face as simply a feature among features, neither defining it nor concealing its fundamental expressions. He rode with the unhurried confidence of a man who had stopped performing certainty and had started actually possessing it. He saw her on the porch, and the smile came out, the sunrise smile, as immediate as it had always been. She raised her hand to him. He rode into the yard and swung down from the horse and tied it to the post and came up the porch steps and sat beside her, and they looked at the valley together in the way they had looked at rivers and stars and each other, with the shared attentiveness of two people who have decided that looking at things together is the best version of looking at anything. "Thomas wrote something today," Maria said. "In school. Dolores showed me. It was an essay on the history of the territory. He wrote about the crossing." Edgar looked at her. What did he say about it? He said that the crossing was built and maintained by a man named Bancroft who charged 15 cents for its use, and who was so serious about its maintenance that he was feared by everyone who came through, and that because of this seriousness the bridge lasted and the valley was able to grow into what it became. She paused. He wrote, "My mother was not afraid of him. She paid the 15 cents and went across. That is how they met, and that is how we all came to live here." Edgar was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He left out the part where she was terrified. I choose not to tell that part to the children," she said. "Why not?" "Because the lesson is not about being unafraid," she said. "The lesson is about proceeding despite it, and he is 8. He will have time to learn the distinction." She looked at the valley. "When he has something to be afraid of." Edgar put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the autumn sun was warm on the porch and the cottonwoods were gold in the distance and the river was running somewhere below them, invisible and audible, permanent and moving, the way the best things always are. In December of 1889, just past the 11th anniversary of their first meeting at the crossing, their third child was born. A girl this time, small and fierce and immediately opinionated about her own comfort. They named her Alice. Thomas, 9, took the news with studied calm and then spent the first evening of Alice's life sitting next to her cradle with a book open on his lap that he was not reading, watching her sleep with an expression that was pure Bancroft, serious and complete, and entirely committed to the importance of this thing. James, 4, wanted to hold her immediately and required adult supervision for the attempt, and was then extremely pleased with himself for the rest of the day, and announced Alice's existence to everyone he encountered for the following week as if he personally was responsible for it. Edgar held Alice in the evening of her first day with the same careful hands and the same full-open face, and looked across the lamplight at Maria, who was tired and satisfied and entirely present, and said nothing at all because nothing needed to be said, and they were people who knew the difference between the silences that needed filling and the silences that were already full. Full of the 40 acres that had been a flat claim with a creek through the northern edge, and were now a home with a garden and a porch and bookshelves built by hand. Full of the school that had been an empty surveyor's office, and was now a real institution with 47 students and a reputation reaching Santa Fe. Full of a crossing that had been a lone man and a gun and a toll post, and was now a piece of civic infrastructure managed by the man who had once been feared for it, who was now the town's sheriff, who came home every evening to a lamp that was on and a door that was open. full of a woman who had sat in a window in Ohio and felt the tight, restless thing behind her ribs and understood, when she saw the valley for the first time through the pass, that it was not restlessness at all. It was recognition. It was the thing in you that knows its place before you do and pulls at you across the distance like a compass needle pulls toward north, not frantic, not afraid, just steady and insistent and correct. She had arrived. Completely. She had arrived, and so had he, the man who had been holding himself at distance from everything good for 6 years, who had built a wall at a crossing and defended it with silence and a gun and a reputation for being the most feared man in 3 counties, until a woman in a cracked coin purse put 15 cents on a flat post with a steady hand and looked at him like a toll sign and proceeded without looking back. They had both arrived. Together. At this. Thomas grew up and went to the county college in 1891 on a recommendation from the territorial education official, who had visited the school years before and had remembered it specifically when the question of scholarship candidates arose. He came home in the summers and in his second year brought a friend whose name was Oliver, and whose presence at the dinner table was awkward in the way that presence always is when a young man is trying to make a particular impression, and knows that everyone at the table is aware of this. And Maria and Edgar managed this with the combined skill of 2 people who did not miss much, and were wise enough not to let on that they missed nothing. James at 12 was already the best reader in his class by a distance that Dolores described as somewhat unfair to the other students, which was the fond complaint of a good teacher about a student who has made teaching them too easy. He was also, at 12, beginning to show the particular interest in the natural sciences that would shape the rest of his life, spending his free hours at the creek identifying plants and rocks and small creatures with the focused intensity of a scientist who has not yet been told that is what he is. Alice at 4 was a force of nature so specific and directed that Edgar said, privately and with deep affection, that she was the only person he had ever met who might actually have been less afraid at the crossing than Maria had been, because at least Maria had been afraid and managed it, whereas Alice's relationship with obstacles appeared to involve not noticing them long enough for them to register as obstacles. Maria at 41 taught school and ran her household and tended her garden and sat on the porch in the evenings with Edgar and the growing children, and looked at the valley that had been wild and unknown, and was now the known and beloved shape of her life. And she was happy in the way that is not separate from difficulty or challenge or the daily weight of real things, but is woven through all of it, the way gold is woven through rock, present in the ordinary substance of everything. On the last evening of 1889, she and Edgar sat on the porch after the children were in bed and the year was turning over and the valley was cold and clear and the stars were so dense and low that they seemed almost reachable. "Do you remember what you said to me," she said, "on my birthday in 1879, the first birthday?" "I said I would not forget it," he said. "Before that, what you said when you gave me the book." He thought for a moment. "Happy birthday, Maria." "Yes," she said. "And the way you said it," she paused. "It was the first time you used my name aloud to me directly." He was quiet, remembering. "I had been thinking it for months," he said. "Your name." "I know," she said. "I knew then." "How did you know?" "Because of the way you said it," she said. "Like it was something you had been carrying and were finally putting down, carefully, in a good place." He looked at the stars. "That is exactly what it was," he said. She put her hand in his hand on the porch railing, the same rail he had repaired on that first Sunday when Rosa had come with tortillas and a comprehensive raised eyebrow, the rail that had been repaired twice since and would need repairing again. The same rail on the same porch of the same house that had been built from nothing on a flat 40-acre claim, because a woman in Ohio had received a letter and understood it as a door opening. The year turned over. The valley held them in its copper-colored, indifferent, extraordinary arms. The cottonwoods and the creek and the schoolhouse and the crossing and the lamp in the window and the books on the shelves he had built and the children asleep in their rooms and the stars overhead in their unchanged patterns and the 2 of them on the porch arrived, completely arrived. The tight, restless thing was home. The long, solitary man was home. The crossing was a civic institution. The secrets were known. The dark past was not gone, because it never goes, but it was placed correctly, behind rather than ahead, a road rather than a wound, a thing that had brought them here rather than a thing that defined where they were. The most feared man at the crossing had laid down his fee and his gun and his isolation, and the woman who had handed him exact change without flinching had handed him, in the end, exactly this. Exactly what he had not known he was waiting for. Exactly what she had not known she was carrying. 15 cents across a bridge in November, and everything that followed, and all of it exact. Exact and right and real and whole.